My name is Brittany. I am the Museum Education Coordinator here at the Gilb Museum, and it's really amazing to be doing this program with Senior Services, especially because as the museum, we do hope to further the legacy of people like the Baldwin family. So today we're going to be exploring Clara Baldwin-Stocker, and I am very excited. So I hope that you all find so much interest in this program. And if you wanted to see this program or any of our previous programs in the Baldwin series, you could always check out the Gilb Museum's YouTube page. We have all of the videos right there. So if you all can just give me 1 minute, I'm going to actually share my screen so you can all see my presentation. Can everybody see that okay? Perfect. All righty. So today, as I said, we are exploring Clara Baldwin-Stocker. Here she is. She's pictured with her father, Elias Jackson Baldwin, also known as Lucky Baldwin. He's kind of known around the area as that. She is also pictured here with her daughter Rosebud and her grandson Joseph Melender. And I'm very excited that we're exploring Clara Baldwin-Stocker. She has a very interesting legacy. We're talking about the city of Arcadia. And just to introduce the staff, we have Stevie. You might have seen her earlier. She is the Historical Museum Curator of the Gilb Museum, and I am the Museum Education Coordinator. So I'm very happy that you're here with us today. We are in charge of the Gilb Museum, which collects, highlights, and preserves historical items relating to the history of Arcadia, and that includes stories and research. We have a lot of research of people, for people like Clara Baldwin-Stocker, and so we're going to be looking at her legacy today. Clara was the first daughter of Elias Jackson Baldwin. She was really well known for being a very big partier. She really loved her parties. She was a big money spender, and she had a really big love of jewels. So that's kind of what she's known for in the context of Arcadia history. Her parties were quite well known, and she was very closely followed in the media. She was really sensationalized and kind of gives you an insight into very early celebrity culture, if we wanted to look at it in that context. Today we're going to explore all these topics about her as we dive really deeply into her world, starting with the fact that she was born May 14th, 1847 in Porter County, Indiana. So she was a product of her father's first marriage to Sarah Ann Unruh, a girl from a neighboring farm. They were married in 1846. And her parents were merely teenagers. They were always in search of new economic opportunities. And we have to think of 1847 as a very interesting time. If we're talking about 1847, Clara was actually born 1 year before Joseph Sutter discovered gold in the American River in California, and she would be born 2 years before the California Gold Rush. So she's born in this really interesting time. If we're talking about the state of California, she wasn't born in California, but she would become more involved there. It was where she grew up and spent the majority of her life. But when she was about 3 years old, her family, Elias Jackson, Sarah Ann, and Clara, they moved to Racine, Wisconsin, where Elias established his very first hotel. It was called Racine House, and he also worked as a greengrocer. This move actually proved to be a really big turning point for the Baldwins, because it was here that Elias Jackson actually heard the first news about gold in California and all of the economic opportunities that could be made there. But Elias Jackson Baldwin, he was more thoughtful about his money making. While a lot of people, their eyes were on the gold that could be found in California, Elias Jackson, he knew that the real money to be made was in selling and trading goods. So in 1853, Clara, Sarah Ann, and Elias Jackson, they packed up 2 wagons and they moved out west. This is a map showing the 1853 overland travels to the west. They followed this red trail. So first they had to go from Wisconsin to Missouri, and then they followed this red trail. They encountered a lot of people. They went through Salt Lake City to California. And so by the time 1853 rolls around, Clara, she's 6 years old, and she rode in the wagon with her mother and the family's furniture. And not much is really known about this point in Clara's life, but it's very likely that what she was doing was helping to collect buffalo chips to make fires, and then also helped her mother cook over the same fire. The family crossed through the Nebraska Territory, Wyoming, Utah, and in the August of 1853, they crossed the state line into California, and they entered the city that was then known as Hangtown, California, but is now known as Placerville. And the family continued on to San Francisco, where Elias immediately got involved in the purchasing and flipping of hotels. And the Baldwin family at that time became moderately prosperous. Elias Jackson, he also got involved in like other business ventures such as brick making, which was perfect because at this time San Francisco was a city that was growing at a very fast rate. He also got involved in the buying and trading of stocks in mines. So very, very interesting time. And here I have pictured a drawing from Lucky Baldwin's biography by C.B. Glassock. This is the family as they encountered Native Americans. Apparently there was a brawl with certain Native Americans. Glassock doesn't really say who these Native Americans were, and there's not really any other accounts into what this encounter was like, if it was really this dramatic. Lucky and Clara and Sarah, they never really mentioned it again for the rest of their lives. So unfortunately, we don't know if this is a true rendition of what that encounter was like, but we could only speculate. As he was then known, Elias Jackson Baldwin became more and more involved in his various business ventures. He actually began to neglect his family a little bit, and his relationship with his wife, Sarah Ann, became quite strained when they suffered the loss of a young daughter in 1854. She only lived to be about less than a year old, and then a son in 1857. He was actually just past a year when he unfortunately passed. So Clara was their only child to live into adulthood. And in 1862, when Clara was 15 years old, Elias Jackson Baldwin and Sarah Ann Baldwin, they divorced. And she did take back her maiden name, Sarah Ann Unruh. And Sarah Ann, she remained in San Francisco. She was originally from Ohio, but she did not return. And actually the same year that she and Elias Jackson divorced, she actually married somebody else named Richard Coe Alden. He in his own right was a little interesting. He actually claimed to be a direct descendant of John Alden, one of the original crew members of the Mayflower, although this is a little unsubstantiated. And when we talk about Clara Baldwin, we often mention that she had one sister, Anita Baldwin, but that's not entirely true. Anita was her half sister, and Clara actually had other half siblings on behalf of her mother. And so the same year that Sarah and Unruh and Richard Alden were married, they actually had their first child, which was Clara's half sister, Edith M. Alden. And later they would have a second child, Clara's second half sibling, and that would be Royal Alden. And here we have a showing of the 1870 federal census records showing Sarah Ann Unruh's marriage to Richard Coe Alden and their two children, Edith and Royal, just to show that, you know, she had her whole life away from Elias Jackson Baldwin. Once she and Elias Jackson Baldwin divorced, she didn't just drop off the face of the earth. But for his one child that he still had, Elias Jackson, he really wanted the best for his daughter. So he set up for Clara to attend Mills College, and this was also in 1862. And she did enroll, but she left very soon after to marry a man named J. Van Pelt Mathis, and this was in 1866. And he was an assistant clerk in the San Francisco Customs House. And unfortunately, no physical evidence of this marriage exists. And C.B. Glasscock, he suggests that perhaps the physical copy burned down in the San Francisco fire of 1906. So unfortunately, not much record about this marriage. But this kind of brings Clara into the next stage of her life, which was much more documented than her earlier years, as I mentioned. And it has been very often mentioned that Clara Baldwin resembled her father in at least one way, and that was the fact that she married and divorced often. Her father married 4, sometimes people say up to 6 times, and divorced. And Clara, she did have a similar number of marriages and divorces. So she marries J. Van Pelt Mathis in 1866, but in 1869, they divorce. On April 17th, 1872, Clara gave birth to her first child, who she had with a man named Albert Snyder, a German immigrant and carpenter. And that child was named Albert Snyder Jr. And she and Albert had this child out of wedlock, so they don't marry until June 26, 1872. So there was a little bit like a 2-month discrepancy. But however, this marriage would also not last. Within a year, Clara divorced Snyder and married her third husband, Bud Doble, who you could see pictured here, who was already quite well known for being a horse racer. So this means that in about 10 years, she's married and divorced 3 times. Unfortunately, the same year that she marries Bud Doble, she loses her mother, Sarah Ann Alden. So she kind of loses that connection to that side of her family for a little bit. And there's not much record of her interactions with her other siblings, but they had their own lives. So I think she was doing quite well for herself. And then from here, we move into the big year for the Baldwin family, 1875. And I really hope you stay with me because there's a lot of things that happened in the Baldwin family in 1875. So in 1875, Elias Jackson Baldwin, he takes his first trip to Southern California. He stays in the Pico House, which is in downtown Los Angeles, and you can still see today. He takes a ride out to what is known as Rancho Santa Anita, and he immediately falls in love with the area. He notes upon the abundance of open land and fertile soil, and he declares that, anything could be grown in that soil. So he really puts the pressure on a man named Heiress Newmark, and he actually purchases Rancho Santa Anita. Of course, later, Rancho Santa Anita turns into the city of Arcadia. And then, much like Clara at this time, Lucky Baldwin is also in the midst of a vigorous, what we could call like a boom and bust cycle in his married life. So in 1875, Lucky Baldwin is actually married to a woman named Mary Cochran. Not much is known about her either, except for the fact that she was originally from Louisiana. And it's not really clear why, but his biographer, C.B. Glasscock, claims that Baldwin was so afraid of Mary Cochran and believed that she would poison him at any time, so he would actually not eat any food until she had taken a bite first. The same year, in 1875, Baldwin in Virginia City meets a woman named Virginia Dexter, also known more commonly as Jenny Dexter. And he immediately falls in love with her and takes her on as a mistress. And probably due to Jenny Dexter's urging, Baldwin divorced Mary Cochran and almost immediately married Jenny Dexter. So also in 1875, Elias Jackson Baldwin opens his famed Baldwin Hotel and Theater in San Francisco on Porter Street. And in the same year, Clara and Bud Doble, they have their first daughter, which would be Clara's second child, because she already had her first son, Albert Snyder. So this is her second child, named partially for Bud Doble. Their daughter's name was Rosebud Doble. And the following year, Elias Jackson Baldwin and his new young wife, Jenny Dexter, they give birth to their first daughter, Anita Baldwin, who we already quite know very well. So this would be Elias Jackson Baldwin's second child, and Clara had her second child. So that means that Clara and her own sister, they were separated by about 29 years. But Anita and her own niece, they were only separated by 1 year, Anita being the aunt, but also the younger one. So very interesting time for the family. And a lot of this is happening in the Baldwin Hotel. They all shared a apartment, so that's very interesting. One could only wish that they were a fly on the wall listening to those conversations. Oops, sorry, wrong direction. But given their vast age differences, Clara and Anita were not very close. Later, Clara divorced Bud Doble, making this her third divorce. And she testified very publicly that Bud wanted her to keep house, but she would rather have lived in a hotel. So they did divorce. And as kind of an early sign of her disconnection from her children, Bud Doble divorced Clara and actually took Rosebud. So Rosebud didn't live with Clara anymore in the Baldwin Hotel, as far as we can tell. And in 1878, Clara would marry Harold Stocker, who was an opera singer. His stage name was Stuart Harold. But he was also sometimes known as Harry Randolph Stocker. So a little difficult to find sometimes in genealogical records because he had so many names. But Harold Stocker would actually be very instrumental in the transformation of Rancho Santa Anita from a ranch to an incorporated city. So that takes place in 1903. Lucky Baldwin, he puts in a petition to have Arcadia incorporated. And Harold Stocker actually serves as a city council member between 1904 and 1914. So that was really helpful. You know, when Lucky Baldwin, he does start the city, he does have Harold Stocker to help him out. And that's his own son-in-law. So they were very close, it seems. And so that's kind of how Harold becomes very involved with the family. The couple, Clara and Harold, they become more interested in living in Arcadia at this point. So they move from San Francisco to Arcadia, and they start several business ventures, you could say. In 1904, Clara and Harold had a jolly celebration to celebrate their opening of the Clara Villa Hotel. And Clara Villa is one of those places in Arcadia that has its own sort of reputation. The hotel itself was located on the northwestern corner of First Avenue and St. Joseph Street. It included a rooftop beer garden, a bowling alley, and it was very well known for reports that it had, quote unquote, cribs that could be rented for private parties where women could do their business. So that's a very good way to say that this was a house of ill repute. Clara Villa was known as a hotspot in Arcadia and operated until the closing of the original Santa Anita racetrack in 1909. And also Clara and Harold, they would get to building their permanent home, which was known as Twin Oaks in Arcadia. This was on Foothill, but was then known as White Oak Boulevard. The grounds included a carriage house with maids' quarters, and the house actually still stands today. You can see it, but for privacy reasons, we will not share that address. And it was very well known that Clara and Harold would host very wild parties at Twin Oaks, and sometimes their parties could last for 2 to 3 days. And apparently one night during a party, there was a heated argument that led to a shootout and a bullet being permanently lodged in the front of the house. So that gives you an insight into Clara and her life. And for several years, Clara and Harold, they lived happily together until Harold unfortunately passed in 1918. But also, if we backtrack a little bit further back, in 1909, Elias Jackson Baldwin died. And Clara and her sister Anita, they actually stood to inherit millions in land holdings, money, personal possessions, and other assets. And it is estimated that the two inherited about 33,000 acres of land valued at almost $11 million. There was also a revealing when Lucky Baldwin died that he had a third daughter named Rosella. She's sometimes referred to as Zelda or Rosella Selby, who received about 200 acres of land. So very interesting time for the Baldwin family as well. Very unfortunate for Lucky Baldwin's passing, but this did not stop Claire from living her lavish life. If anything, it fueled it more. With her inheritance, Clara vowed that she would have, quote unquote, the very best sort of a good time, and was known for saying, "For what is money if not to give one access to the real enjoyments of life?" So with her riches, Claire earned herself a reputation for very lavishly spending money. She was known to have a great love for jewels, and we could probably see that in this photo here. It was very well known that she would not go out unless she wore at least one ring per finger, including on her pinky and thumbs. And some people even speculated, and it was mentioned in the Los Angeles Times, that she even had jewels sewn into her stockings. And in 1913, the Los Angeles Times estimated that Clara had about $1 million worth of jewelry. She also purchased for herself a $200,000 steam yacht, a wardrobe worth over $100,000, a private railroad car, and a specially made locomobile car, which was painted in a very vivid lavender or purple. And this is all according to her grandson, Joe Melander. She was also said to have dyed her hair a very bright red. We can't really see that very well in the photo, unfortunately, but she was also known to wear very gaudy clothes and kept her social calendar very packed with outings and parties. She also partially took up residence in the Alexandria Hotel, which is also in downtown Los Angeles, where she had even more parties. Her own personal wealth began to also grow when property that her father had left her in the city of Montebello began to gush oil, which brought her additional millions of dollars. But unfortunately, Clara's lavish lifestyle brought her a host of problems. Apparently, she fell behind on many of her tax payments and actually had to be bailed out several times by her sister, Anita. And that still did not stop her from spending all of her money and treating herself to the finest luxuries in life. Her reputation for always being bedecked in jewels brought her some personal drama where there were several attempts made to steal her jewels. For example, in 1916, a woman, a society woman, interestingly enough, Leota Northam, she stole about $100,000 worth of jewels from Clara Baldwin. And Northam and her husband Omar Toft were later arrested after they were found trying to pawn the jewels for money. There was also drama when Clara was out on a boat and some pirates apparently once tried to steal her jewels from her boat. And probably the most publicly made public in the papers, I should say, In 1917, Clara's own son, Albert Snyder Jr., claimed that she was too incompetent to handle her finances and brought her into court to have her deemed incompetent. And he said that he himself should be in control of her $10 million estate. He also said that her business manager kept her as part of a harem. Very interestingly enough, that was one of the things that he used against her in the court, and said that she just didn't know how to spend money and that he, the man, should be in charge. I guess you could say, thankfully for Clara, he did not win the court case, but this really goes to show how disconnected she was from her own children. And she had a very frosty relationship with both of them for very many years, but it is said that very, very late in her life, she and her children seemed to have reconciled. So that was very good for them. But for a few years after this, Clara seemed to have calmed down a little bit. She wasn't in the papers as much until, unfortunately, on February 27th, 1929, at the age of 84 in Glendale, California, Clara, she actually slipped on a rug in her summer home and broke her hip. She was brought to a sanitarium in Glendale where she was kind of in a cycle where she would get better for a while and then she would get much, much worse. But she eventually developed a fever and she died. At the time of her death, Clara's estate was estimated to be worth $10 million, with $1.5 million just being her valuable jewelry collection, which was mostly diamonds. Much of her ownings were also in real estate. She owned land in Arcadia, Baldwin Hills, Inglewood, Montebello, as was previously mentioned. Her son and daughter, they rushed to arrange for her funeral. Also, her half-sister, Edith, who was her half-sister by her mother, she also rushed to be with her sister at her funeral. So it seems that while she was not very connected with her family earlier in her life, in her last moments, her family kind of got together for Clara. She was buried at the Angeles Rosedale Cemetery, which is actually in Los Angeles, near the University of Southern California. She was buried in the Stocker Mausoleum because she, at the time of her death, she still had connection to the Stocker family. She never actually divorced Harold Stocker, and she kept that name with her until she died. She did leave behind her own legacy. She lent her name to Baldwin-Stocker Elementary, which opened in 1964 and is still part of the Arcadia community to this day. In 1943, her grandson used some money left aside in Clara's will to create a home for women that were without help from their families and who could no longer care for themselves. And the home is actually still known to this day as the Clara Baldwin-Stocker Home in Covina, and it accepts male and female patients. So Clara, she's kind of the embodiment of somebody who lived very fast and just had this very lavish way of living. She was very different from her father and her sister. While they were both very taciturn, Clara was not the same. But she did go from being that small girl sitting in a wagon, almost poor, landless with her mother and father on the California Trail, to being this woman who was always going out covered in diamonds. So she had a very interesting life, and it kind of really illustrates how the family's move to California was really transformative in their lives. So she's a very interesting woman, much harder definitely to research. Most of what we could find about Clara is mostly in the newspapers. And unfortunately, this brings us to the end of our Clara Baldwin-Stocker program. This is also the last of our programs in the Baldwin series. If any of you has any questions, we would be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. That was very informative. What an interesting life the Baldwins had. I didn't know they had that many divorces in that age.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, definitely. I think we always think that, back in the day, they weren't divorcing as much as they are now, but maybe they were doing it more. I'm not sure. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us.